Hey there, viewers! Some stories don't begin with a headline, they begin with a whisper, a sealed courtroom, a name scratched into concrete, and a man who once stood on top of the world now begging behind bars for a sentence that was never meant to be public. This isn't about fame anymore. It's about what was signed in silence and who came to collect. Let's get into it. Chapter 1: The Letter That Changed My Life. I've never been the type to get involved in other people's business. I'm a postal worker. Been one for almost 16 years now. My routine is simple: wake up at 5, toast some bread, check my back for muscle aches, and head out. My world is small, quiet, filled with envelopes, junk mail, weather reports, and the smell of warm plastic from the sorting machines. I've never had a need for much excitement, and frankly, I liked it that way. So when the envelope arrived, I almost tossed it aside like I did with credit card offers and low-rate loan scams. It was thicker than usual, with an official-looking seal pressed into the paper. The wax was dark red, almost burgundy, and the lettering had this strange shimmer to it under the kitchen light. It didn't look like any government mail I'd seen before, and I've delivered more than my fair share. I slid it open with the butter knife, still halfway chewing on a slice of dry toast. The paper inside was cream-colored, heavier stock, and the ink bled just a little at the corners, like someone had rushed the printing job. At the top, in bold block letters, summons for jury service. I groaned. Figures. I scanned it slowly, expecting it to be some civil case or small-time criminal matter. Probably a landlord evicting someone or a DUI charge. But then I saw it. United States versus Combs. I reread it, then I read it again. I sat down at the table, toast forgotten in my hand. My wife walked in, hair still wrapped in a scarf, holding her phone like she always did in the mornings. "Everything okay?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't answer right away. I just handed her the letter. She read it in silence. Then slowly, she set it down on the table and folded her arms. "Don't go near that circus," she said. Her voice was sharp, scared even. "I have to," I said. "It's federal. You don't just ignore something like this." I don't care if it's the president himself asking. That man's name been attached to more scandals than I can count. People die in rooms connected to him. Women vanish. And now they're putting him on trial. She paused, eyes locked on mine. "You don't want that in your life." I didn't respond. Truth was, I didn't want it either. But there was something strange about the way that envelope had shown up. I don't know how to explain it, but the moment I held it, my chest felt tight, like the air had shifted, like something had already chosen me before I even read a word. I tucked it back into the envelope and didn't speak about it again that night. But I kept thinking about all the stories I'd heard, about the women, Cassie Ventura, the singer who'd filed that lawsuit and then settled it within 24 hours, about the rumors of the parties, the lawsuits piling up, about the videos they said were coming, the tapes, the silence from the industry, and now a federal trial. It was all too loud to ignore. A part of me wanted to throw the envelope into the trash, but another part of me, a quieter, stubborn part, wanted to see for myself, not out of curiosity, not even out of justice, just something deeper, like a pull. A week later, I showed up to the courthouse. They had 3 streets closed off, security everywhere, not just regular uniforms either. There were men in suits, dark glasses, standing stone-faced at every corner, cameras mounted on their shoulders. They didn't look like marshals, more like contractors. I've delivered mail to enough government buildings to tell the difference. These guys weren't on any public payroll. Media vans were parked bumper to bumper, their satellite dishes pointed to the heavens like hungry mouths. Protesters were lined up outside the barricades, some shouting for justice, others waving signs defending Diddy like he was some kind of holy man. Free Puff! They're lying for clout. One sign simply said the devil dances in Paris in dripping red paint. I didn't know what that meant. Inside the building, the air was stale and cold. Every person had to go through a metal detector twice. Dogs sniffed our shoes and bags. I passed through, palms sweaty, clutching my ID like it was a shield. In the jury waiting room, nobody said much. Just sideways glances and the kind of forced breathing people do when they're trying to seem calm. I scanned the room. Average folks. A janitor, a teacher, a man who looked like he drove freight. Nobody famous, no high-profile types, just us. The bailiff eventually called us into the selection chamber. The walls were beige, dull, the lights humming faintly overhead. I sat in the back row. They started reading off names. I waited, and then... the bell. I stood up, heart thudding like a drum in my chest. We were led into the actual courtroom. That's when I felt it. The change. The air shifted. It was like stepping into a different reality, not just because of the grandeur, the oak panels, the towering flags, the wide ceiling that echoed every shuffle of a shoe. No, it was something else. Something behind the walls or beneath them. There were cameras mounted discreetly, a red velvet barrier between us and the press bench, 2 armed guards on either side of the judge's platform. And at the table, dressed in navy blue, hands clasped in front of him, sat Combs. He didn't look like the man I remembered from TV or album covers. The mogul, the icon, the one in white tuxedos, smiling wide with a diamond watch peeking from his cuff. He looked older, thinner. His hair had turned gray, not salt and pepper, just gray. His beard was neatly trimmed, but it looked like it had lost its fight with age. His eyes, they weren't dull. They were alert, almost too alert, like something inside him was more awake than the rest of him. He wasn't watching the judge, or the prosecutors, or the cameras. He was watching us. The jurors. When I sat down, I felt it before I saw it, his eyes resting right on me. Not scanning, not glancing, just watching. For a split second, I looked back. And I wish I hadn't. His eyes didn't blink, they didn't twitch, but something flickered behind them. A shimmer, like heat waves over asphalt, like something was looking out through them. I broke eye contact. My hands were sweating through the paper they'd given us. The judge began to speak, going through the motions of instructions. I barely heard him. All I could think about was that stare, not because it was angry, not because it was cold. Because it felt like he already knew something about me. As the day went on, they asked questions to determine if we were impartial. I gave my answers, calm, polite, safe. But in the back of my mind, one question kept crawling back. What had I just signed up for? And why did it feel like something already knew I would say yes? Chapter 2, MDC's ghost steps into the courtroom. The next morning, the courthouse didn't just feel like a place for justice. It felt like a fortress. There were more cameras now, more barriers, more faces pressed against the fencing. Some were crying. Others were chanting. Some just stood still, holding signs like they were at a funeral. The media vans had doubled, and the reporters moved like bloodhounds behind the metal pens, shouting questions to anyone who looked like they might have something useful to say. The guards outside were stone-faced, dressed in matte black, and for the first time in my life, I wondered if they were armed beneath their jackets. Not with pistols, but with something heavier, something meant for chaos. We passed through security again, even more intense this time. No phones, no watches, nothing but ID and clothing. One juror had to remove a metal dental crown because the scanner kept beeping. The entire process felt less like walking into a courtroom and more like checking into a high-security research lab. Inside, the room was still the same in shape, but the air was. The seats were full now. The benches where the press sat were shoulder to shoulder with industry figures and grim-looking journalists, their pens poised like weapons. I recognized a few faces from television. One anchor in particular who used to praise Diddy's career rise during the bad boy era now sat with his jaw set, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Then the doors opened. We didn't see him at first, just the backs of the U.S. Marshals moving in tandem, precise, deliberate. Then the murmuring started. A sharp inhale here, a stifled gasp there. Some reporters tried to hold back their reaction, others didn't bother. And then he walked in. Diddy, but not the Diddy anyone remembered. He wasn't wearing a suit, not the crisp white tuxedo from his parties or the designer black leather he used to rock on stage. No sunglasses, no diamonds, just a navy blue jumpsuit with white letters stenciled over the chest, MDCBKLYN. He looked broken. He was thinner, not fit thin, but drained, hollowed out. His cheeks had sunk inward just enough to change the shape of his face. His beard, which had once been perfectly edged, was fully gray now, and it looked like it hadn't been trimmed in days. The hair on his head was the same, gray, dry, short, brushed but dull. He didn't walk like a man who owned the room. He shuffled, wrists chained together, his posture stiff and unnatural. But even like that, the room bent around him. People stared. Some looked away as if making eye contact with him would bring a curse. Others watched like they were trying to find the old Diddy hiding underneath the prison exterior. A few seemed disappointed that the man before them didn't carry the swagger they remembered. But I didn't care about any of that. Because when he passed the jury box, I caught it again. That smell. It wasn't cologne, it wasn't body odor. It was sharp, metallic, like the air right before a storm breaks, like the inside of a burnt wire. It didn't cling to his clothes, it followed him, moved with him, breathed with him. I turned slightly, trying to catch it again as he passed, and it hit me in the nose like a cold knife. I didn't say anything, neither did anyone else. He sat down between his lawyers, his chained hands placed gently on the table, and waited. Quiet, still. The judge entered and we all rose. The formalities began, names, introductions, procedural motions, but I barely heard them. My eyes kept going back to him. He didn't twitch. He didn't fidget. His eyes were cast forward but not focused on the judge. It was like he was watching something else entirely, or waiting for something to arrive. Then came opening statements. The prosecution went first. A tall, wiry woman with a voice that didn't shake. She didn't waste time. There was no drama, no theatrics. She laid it out cold. For over 2 decades, she began, the man you see here did not just entertain America. He manipulated, threatened, coerced, and profited from the destruction of others. There was a stir in the room. Cameras clicked in bursts. She continued, her voice steady. You will hear testimonies from individuals who were exploited, from employees who feared speaking up, from victims who were silenced. You will see evidence, videos, messages, photographs that prove this was not about music or parties. This was a system, a network built on power, secrecy, and fear. She paused, letting that last word settle. And when it served him no longer, he erased them, or tried to. No one breathed. I didn't even blink. When she finished, the defense stood. He was younger, smoother in speech, dressed immaculately, even more than Diddy had been back in his prime. He smiled, more to the cameras than the jury. Ladies and, he began, we live in an era of narratives. of viral accusations, social media outrage, and revisionist history. I could already feel where it was going. Yes, Mr. Combs lived a wild life. He hosted parties. He indulged in a lifestyle many of us cannot imagine. But everything you will hear in this courtroom happened between consenting adults. What the prosecution calls abuse, we call consent. What they call trafficking, we call open relationships and exploration. He is not a criminal. He is not a monster. He is a man being punished for being successful and misunderstood. There was a strange pause after that. A few jurors shifted. Some nodded, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. Others looked confused. Me, I sat still. I didn't chuckle, didn't smirk. My eyes went right back to Diddy. Because while his lawyer was painting him as a misunderstood man, Diddy didn't even blink. He just stared at the wall in front of him. Still, blank, cold. And then right at the end of the statement, he smiled. Just barely. Not at anyone, not at anything in particular. Just a faint curl of the lips, like a private joke had wandered through his head and decided to stay a while. After that, the judge called for a recess. We were taken back into the jury room for 15 minutes. Nobody said much. One woman rubbed her wrist like it hurt. Another man stared out the small, frosted window like he was looking for an exit. When we returned to the courtroom, Diddy was already seated. His hands were no longer shackled, but his posture hadn't changed. The prosecutor stood again. "Your Honor," she said, "the government calls its first witness." There was a pause as someone stood behind the curtain at the side entrance. "A protected identity," she added, "who will testify under federal anonymity guidelines." The curtain shifted. A woman stepped forward, dressed in black slacks and a turtleneck. Her face was obscured by a large, wide-brimmed hat pulled down to shadow her features. Even her voice was altered electronically, a soft distortion that made it sound like she was speaking through a fan. But the emotion in it was real. "I lived in the chateau," she said, her voice trembling. "I was one of many." And just like that, the courtroom shrank. Not in size, but in feeling. It was as if the walls leaned in, the light dimmed, the floor beneath us turned to something softer, more unstable. Like we weren't in a courtroom anymore. But a stage. A stage for something very old, and very, very wrong. That night, I didn't sleep well. When I finally did, I dreamed of women with painted mouths. Red lipstick so thick it looked like blood. They whispered in tongues I'd never heard but somehow understood. Their eyes glowed faintly like coals in a dying fire, and they pointed at me without moving their arms. They moved together in sync, breathing in time. And in the center of them stood Diddy, not in a jumpsuit but in white, smiling, waiting. I woke up covered in sweat, the sound of his whisper still in my ears. "You're not a juror," he said. "You're the offering." Chapter 3. The Women Behind the Door. By the second day, the courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like something was settling over the room, an invisible weight, thick and cloying. Every time the door creaked open, every time a new name was called or a chair shifted or a light buzzed slightly overhead, my stomach knotted like it was bracing for something awful. And every time I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was just tired or anxious, something would happen that proved I was. When the next set of witnesses were brought in, they didn't walk through the usual side entrance. The marshals led us out first, then back, and once the screens had been erected, large, opaque panels stretching nearly to the ceiling, with only a narrow outline of the figure behind visible if you looked just right. We weren't allowed to see them, and they weren't allowed to see us. Their voices, when they spoke, came out electronically, blurred and low, like someone had filtered their confession through a failing radio transmission. But nothing could cover up the emotion. Their pain pierced through every bit of distortion, bleeding out through the static and swallowing the room whole. The first woman who called herself spoke with a quiet tremble that made the hairs on my arms stand up. She said she'd been 19 when she was first invited. It wasn't a club, not even a party, really. It was a freak-off, she said, a term I'd never heard before but would never forget. Private, password only, a string of digits texted to her with no context, just a time and a dress code. Red and gold, always red and gold. She said the doors were guarded by men with no names, just nods and radios. Inside, you were given a drink, a robe if you didn't bring the right attire, and led to what she called the offering room. She said the walls were lined with mirrors, but not the kind you'd find in a hotel. They were floor to ceiling, and none of them reflected you back quite right. Her voice cracked when she said, "Sometimes I'd move and the girl in the mirror wouldn't, not for a second, just long enough to make me feel crazy." I didn't realize I was gripping my pen so tightly until it snapped in half and a few drops of ink hit my notepad. Each testimony after that felt heavier, more suffocating. One woman, Marla, said that at every event, candles were lit in a circle. Thick red ones, the kind you find in churches, except the wicks smelled like sulfur when they burned. Diddy, she said, would sit in the center, not always participating, but always watching. Sometimes he whispered things no one could hear. Sometimes he would talk in different languages, ones the women didn't recognize. Latin, Hebrew. One time, she swore he wasn't speaking a language at all, just sounds that made her skin crawl. Another that she'd seen symbols, carved into wood, embroidered into red silk curtains, even drawn in ash on the floor. One in particular stuck with her, a pentagram with an eye in the center. She saw it every time, always near the foot of the bed. My throat dried out the longer they spoke. I wanted to swallow, but couldn't. I wasn't the only one. 2 seats to my left, one juror, a woman probably in her late 50s, kept fidgeting. Not the usual kind of discomfort, either. She kept rubbing her thumb into her palm over and over like she was trying to grind something out of her skin. And then near the end of the day, just before the last witness was called, another juror, a younger man, mid-20s, who hadn't said a word all day, stood up, turned toward the door, and vomited onto the floor. He didn't say anything, just bent forward and let it come out, like his body refused to hold in what his mind couldn't process. The marshals rushed him out without a word. When he came back 20 minutes later, his skin looked ashen, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. By the 3rd day of testimony, I'd stopped sleeping. At night, I'd lay in bed, eyes open, heart racing, just waiting. I didn't know for what, but it always felt like something was watching me through the walls. Kept asking if I was okay. I'd nod and lie. She didn't press, but I knew she could tell. The prosecutor didn't slow down. She built the case piece by piece, like a house made of bodies and shadows. And we just sat there, brick by brick, watching it rise. Then came the videos. We weren't shown everything, of course. Some were deemed too graphic or inadmissible, but what we did see was enough. Hotel lobbies, hallways, elevator footage, all time-stamped, all labeled. In one, a woman, identity hidden behind a blur, was dragged down a corridor by her hair, no sound, just motion. A man stood nearby, watching. He never helped. In another, a bedroom door opened, and a girl, barely more than a teenager from the looks of her, stumbled out barefoot and dazed. Her eyes darted to the camera for just a moment. That glance will live in my nightmares. She looked like she'd seen something ancient, something that should stayed buried. But the final clip was the one that broke something in me. Cassie Ventura, I recognized her, so did everyone else. No blur, no anonymity. It was from 2016, a hallway in a high-end hotel. The camera angle was high and the color was off, more gray than anything else, but the moment was clear. Cassie walked out first, fast, looking back over her shoulder. Then Diddy came out after her, shirtless, barefoot, swinging. He grabbed her by the back of the neck, slammed her to the floor, and kicked her twice before walking off. No audio, no context. Just raw, undeniable violence. Some of the jurors looked away. One woman covered her mouth. Another man just closed his eyes and didn't open them again until the screen went dark. I kept watching. Because I had to. Because pretending it wasn't real wouldn't make it disappear. My hand trembled as I tried to take notes. The pen felt foreign in my fingers, like I was trying to write underwater. My pulse pounded in my ears. And through it all, I felt it again, that same metallic scent, like ozone and iron, like something old was waking up around us. There were no cameras pointed at the jury. That was the rule. No one could see us. No one could record us. We were supposed to be invisible. But I felt eyes. Not just Diddy's, not just the witnesses, something else. Something beyond the courtroom. Something waiting. And then came the final testimony of the day. She called herself. She walked in behind the screen slowly, like her legs weren't entirely her own. Her voice was warped like the others, but her cadence was clearer, like she wanted to be heard through the filter. She didn't cry, she didn't pause. She spoke like someone delivering a eulogy. "There's something he worships," she said. The room shifted. Something not from here. It comes when the music stops, when the mirrors are covered, when the women are silent. She said she saw it once, not fully, just its shape in the corner of a darkened room, eyes like coals, teeth like broken glass, and a voice that sounded like her own but speaking backwards. "It doesn't need a name," she whispered, "but he calls it." A few reporters dropped their pens. The judge called for order, but no one moved. I continued. "He doesn't pray to it, he feeds it, with fear, with flesh, with silence. And every time we danced, every time we smiled for the cameras, we helped him do it." Her voice dropped lower, almost a hum. Then she said something I'll never forget. She turned, though she couldn't see us, and faced our side of the room. Her shadow behind the screen stretched slightly, long and thin like a stretched neck. And she said almost gently, "They'll mark you too." That was when the light above the jury box flickered. Just once. Just long enough. I didn't look at Diddy. I didn't need to. I already knew he was smiling. Chapter 4, the day the lights flickered. By the fourth day, I'd stopped trying to rationalize what was happening in that courtroom. I wasn't sleeping anymore, not really. I'd lie in bed with my eyes open, staring at the shadows in the ceiling corners, waiting for them to shift. I stopped telling about the details. She didn't want to hear them anyway. Every morning, she would hand me a cup of coffee without looking me in the eye. Some things she didn't need to know, and I no longer knew how to explain them without sounding unwell. I was beginning to feel like maybe I was. But the courtroom reminded me I wasn't imagining it. That whatever this was, it was real, it was spreading, and it wasn't done with us yet. That morning, the defense team tried to pull back the narrative to stop the hemorrhaging. Their lead attorney stood tall, hands perfectly clasped, voice rehearsed to be firm but fatherly. He said we were watching selective footage, hearing curated testimony, and that all of it was designed to paint a one-dimensional portrait of a man whose life and career were, in his words, as complex as the nation's own cultural history. I remember writing that line down, not because it made sense, but because it was the most elegant way I'd ever heard someone try to say, "Forget the facts." He said the footage we'd seen lacked context, That women were being encouraged to reinterpret their own memories. That Diddy, while a man of intense appetite, had never crossed the lines of legality. He framed the trial as an example of modern-day Salem, where fame and envy had become torches and pitchforks, and social media the gallows. A few jurors nodded, more out of politeness than agreement. I didn't nod, I barely breathed, because from where I sat, Diddy wasn't a scapegoat, he wasn't misunderstood. He was something else entirely. Then the prosecutor stood. She didn't bother with theatrics. She simply said, "We'd like to submit footage from the Metropolitan Detention Center, Your Honor. Surveillance taken from the defendant's cell over a period of 28 days. That got the room's attention. The judge, a stern woman with tired eyes and a voice like gravel, gave a single nod. The lights dimmed, the screen lit up. There he was, Diddy, sitting on a bunk alone. The timestamp rolled along the bottom, October 7th, 2024, 3:11 a.m. At first, it was unremarkable. He sat still, elbows on knees, staring at the wall. But then he turned, looked to the corner of the cell, tilted his head like he was listening to something. He started talking. No sound in the video, but his mouth was moving, slow at first, then faster. His hands gestured. He stood, backed up, paused, then sat again. His mouth didn't stop. He looked scared, then angry, then calm, then scared again. The conversation seemed one-sided. I watched transfixed. I couldn't look away. Then the screen cut to another date, October 17th. Again, late at night. Diddy was on the floor this time, knees drawn up, arms hugging them. He rocked slightly. A shadow passed over his face. There was no one in the room, nothing had moved, but something shifted, just a flicker of darkness barely caught by the camera. Then the screen changed again, October 22nd. This time Diddy stood facing the wall, both palms pressed flat against the concrete. He was whispering, his lips moved in rapid, clipped syllables. Then suddenly he slammed his head forward against the wall. Once, twice, 3 times. A guard appeared on screen seconds later, triggered by the motion sensors. The feed froze there mid-scuffle and faded to black. The lights in the courtroom flickered. It wasn't a surge. It wasn't a subtle dim. It was a sudden stutter, like the entire electrical grid. The judge looked up sharply. She called for a break, blamed the building's age, ordered everyone to stay seated while the court technicians checked the wiring. But I knew it wasn't just faulty lights. I could feel it again, that smell, metallic, ozone, heavy. It filled my nostrils and coated the back of my throat like a memory of something burning. I blinked, trying to clear my head, and when I looked over at Diddy, he was already watching me. This time, he didn't look away. He didn't blink, didn't smile. He just stared. Like he recognized me. Like he'd been waiting for me. During the lunch break, I stepped out into the courtyard behind the courthouse. The fresh air didn't help. I could still feel it on me. The weight of the footage, the heat of those lights, the echo of that stare. One of the federal guards stood nearby. He looked younger than the others, but something about him was older. He wore his badge like it was a curse, not an honor. As I walked past him, he looked me straight in the eye. "You should do the same," he said. "Excuse me," I asked, stopping. He nodded once, subtly, like he was afraid to say it louder. "Bless yourself. Whatever faith you got, use it. That room's not safe." I didn't reply, I just kept walking. When we returned after the break, the judge resumed proceedings, claimed the issue was resolved, claimed everything was fine, but the tension in the air said otherwise. The prosecution brought up a tech specialist, an expert who analyzed the MDC footage frame by frame. He confirmed that the clips were untouched, unedited, and streamed directly from the detention center's internal system. He also mentioned something odd. "There are segments," he said, "where the temperature in the cell drops drastically within seconds." The judge raised an eyebrow. "How do you know that?" "Thermal sensors," he replied. "Standard in solitary units. The system logs everything." He displayed charts on the screen, lines that dipped violently during the nights Diddy had his episodes. "Lowest point recorded," the specialist said, "was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. In a sealed room." "Yes, ma'am. For context, standard cell temperatures are between 67 and 72. "And how long did the cold last?" "Exactly 13 minutes and 13 seconds. No one said anything, not even the defense. That night I returned to my hotel, had insisted I stop sleeping at home, and I found something waiting on my pillow. Not a mint, not a towel folded into a swan. A note. No envelope, just a small square of white paper folded once. I opened it with shaking fingers. The handwriting was sharp, slanted, inked in red. "You're not just here to witness, you're here to decide the offering." I looked around the room. Nothing else was disturbed. My bag sat untouched, my phone still locked in the drawer. The windows closed, no signs of forced entry. But the lights in the bathroom flickered as I stood there. And the air, it smelled like copper and rain. Chapter 5, The Demon in the Defense Strategy. By the 6th day of trial, the courthouse felt like it was holding its breath. The sky over Manhattan hung thick with gray clouds, low and unmoving, as if even the weather was reluctant to look directly at what was unfolding inside that courtroom. People weren't whispering outside anymore. They just stared, not at us but at the building itself, like it had become something other than a place where justice was supposed to live. Inside, the energy had shifted. After the prosecution's avalanche of evidence, the defense had to respond. And they did, boldly, almost recklessly. Their lead attorney stood with a confidence that bordered on delusion, delivering a performance that seemed less intended for us and more for the cameras recording outside the courthouse walls. He opened with a phrase I'll never forget. "What you've heard so far," he said, "is not a criminal case. It is a lifestyle misunderstanding." There was a pause after that, not because anyone needed time to absorb what he said, but because no one could quite believe he'd actually said it. A few jurors shifted. One audibly scoffed. I sat perfectly still. He went on, described Diddy's world as consensual hedonism, said that the so-called freak-offs were merely avant-garde social gatherings, misunderstood by people who projected fear onto freedom. He referenced sex-positive literature, quoted philosophers, even cited case law from the 1970s about what constituted deviant behavior. He called the testimonies of the women emotionally valid but contextually misleading. He insisted that what we saw in the surveillance footage was the behavior of a man under stress, not a man unraveling into madness. Through it all, Diddy didn't move. He sat at the defense table like he was carved from stone. His gray beard caught the overhead light just enough to shimmer in flashes, but his eyes remained half-lidded, unfocused. He didn't look at us. He didn't glance at the screens. He barely blinked. The defense brought in an expert next, a psychologist from a well-known university. Polished, articulate, confident in the way only tenured academics can be. He explained the nuances of sociopathic behavior, dominance theory, and psychological projection. But then, halfway through his testimony, he paused, looked toward Diddy, just for a moment. That's when things began to unravel. The psychologist shifted slightly, like he'd seen something that unsettled him, cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses. He kept talking, but his rhythm had changed. His voice cracked a little. He began reading more from his notes, avoiding eye contact with the defendant. Then he said something that made the room freeze. "Mr. Combs," he began, "exhibits a unique profile, one that is not standard sociopathy or narcissistic personality disorder. There are traits here that suggest predatory transcendence, a desire not just to dominate or control, but to erase, to unmake." The courtroom went silent. He continued, voice slower now. "There is something ancient in his psychology, something that does not seek empathy or pleasure or even power in the traditional sense. It seeks submission, ritual. It wants to be." Someone in the audience let out an audible breath. The sound of the stenographer's keys slowed. Diddy still hadn't moved. But then he did. It started with his head. It tilted back slow and stiff, like a marionette whose strings had been yanked too hard. Then his shoulders rolled unnaturally sharp angles beneath the fabric of his jumpsuit. His fingers twitched, curled, then snapped straight. He let out a sound, not a scream, not a cry, something lower, like a growl trying to form words. His eyes rolled back into his skull. His mouth opened, wider than seemed natural, and a stream of guttural syllables poured out. Everyone froze. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. It didn't even sound like speech. It was liquid and broken and ancient, like a voice trying to claw its way out through a throat that didn't belong to it. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters stood. One juror gasped and stumbled out of her chair. The guards rushed forward. The judge shouted for order, but Diddy kept speaking. Louder, faster. The sounds twisted and bent, vowels colliding into consonants that didn't make sense, like something was glitching inside of him. Then the lights flickered again. Just once, the same metallic taste filled my mouth. Diddy stood now, arms wide, fingers clawed. His mouth stretched in a jagged smile, and he screamed something that made my vision blur. That was the moment the guards tackled him. One jabbed a sedative into his neck. His body convulsed once, hard enough to knock over his chair, then crumpled. The judge ordered the courtroom cleared. People scrambled to their feet, rushing for the exits. I stayed seated, not because I was brave, but because I couldn't move. My legs didn't respond. My chest tightened. My fingers had gone numb. I watched as the guards dragged Diddy's unconscious body out of the room. And then I saw it. Blood. A thin line of it across the floor, starting where he'd collapsed. It trailed behind his body like a thread, disappearing into the hallway beyond. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they didn't want to. That night I didn't dream. I descended. I was back in the red room, but this time it was clearer, sharper. The women in gold circled me again, their feet soundless against the floor. Their eyes were pale, pupils faintly glowing. They didn't speak, but their mouths moved, chanting something silent. The air was thick, too warm. I could smell wax and sweat and something coppery. I looked down at my hands. They were clean. Then I looked again. Red smeared across my fingers, my palm, my wrist. Lipstick blood. I couldn't tell. The women closed in, their movements synchronized, their fingers outstretched. They pressed them to my chest, my forehead, my throat. Then they parted, and Diddy stepped forward. He wasn't in a jumpsuit. He wore white, clean, flowing. His eyes were dark, bottomless, and when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp. "You're not the jury anymore," he said. "You're the vessel." I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the window was closed, the hotel was silent. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashed water on my face. And then I saw it. On my neck. Just below my jawline. A smear. Faint reddish, shaped like lips. But I had been alone all night. Chapter 6, the list of sentences. The day of sentencing didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a reckoning. By the time I stepped off the juror shuttle and walked past the metal barricades, I could already tell something had shifted in the air. The crowd outside the courthouse wasn't shouting anymore. No chanting, no signs in the air, just stillness. Rows of faces pressed to the fence like they were waiting for a bomb to drop, like they didn't want to be near it when it hit but couldn't look away either. Some people wore hoods. Others covered their mouths with scarves, and a few of them just stared upward, like they were expecting something to come down from the sky instead of from inside that courtroom. The security that day had doubled. There were armored vehicles parked around the block. New guards at every door, different uniforms, private, contracted muscle with no name badges, no smiles, and rifles held in plain view. We were scanned twice, not once. Phones confiscated again, even our shoes inspected. A marshal whispered to another as I walked through. "They're taking this one serious." Whatever this one meant, it didn't feel like a verdict. It felt like a ritual. Inside, the room was colder than usual. The lights overhead buzzed louder than before, flickering just at the edge of perception. The bailiff stood stiff at the front, hands folded behind his back like he was bracing for an earthquake. Reporters filled the benches again, scribbling in notepads and whispering through clenched jaws. I looked at the jury box. Every one of us looked worse than we had a week ago. Bags under our eyes, color gone from our skin, eyes hollowed out by what we'd seen, what we'd heard, and what we'd felt. No one joked anymore. No one made small talk. We weren't strangers now, we were survivors. Then the side door opened. Diddy shuffled in, flanked by 4 guards. He didn't look up, he didn't scan the room. He looked broken, no, not just tired, dissolved. Like something had slowly emptied out of him day by day, and now there was barely enough left to hold up his body. His jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, the fabric bunched at the sleeves as though he'd lost even more weight. His gray beard was fuller now, untrimmed, wiry, and wild. His hair, once manicured, now looked like it hadn't been touched in weeks. There was something different about his skin, too duller, waxier, lifeless. He was seated gently by the guards. His chains rattled softly as he folded his hands on the table. He didn't blink much. He didn't react when the judge entered. When we were told to rise, he didn't move until one of the guards yanked him to his feet. When we sat, he remained standing for a few seconds longer than everyone else, like he hadn't heard the instruction. The judge began reading. One by one, she spoke the charges aloud. Her voice was slow, measured, like she was reading off commandments. Count 1, racketeering conspiracy. Count 2, transportation for the purpose of prostitution. Count 3, coercion and enticement. Count 4, sex trafficking. Count 5, interstate conspiracy. Count 6, obstruction of justice. Count 7, witness intimidation. Count 8, money laundering. There were more. I stopped counting after 10. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick and brittle, like if you moved wrong it might crack. Diddy didn't react. He stared forward unmoved, like he wasn't even listening, or like someone else was listening for him. The judge paused before the sentencing phase. There was silence for a full 10 seconds. And then Diddy raised his hand. Not high, just barely above the table, a small motion, but it made everyone go still. The judge narrowed her eyes. "Mr. Combs, you will have an opportunity to speak after sentencing." He didn't lower his hand. Instead, he spoke. "I want to speak to the vessel." No one knew what he meant. You could see it on their faces. The reporters all turned to each other. Even the prosecutor stiffened. The judge frowned. Speak to whom? Diddy didn't repeat himself. He just turned his head slowly toward the jury box. His eyes landed on me. Not scanned, not glanced. Locked. The vessel, he said again, voice like a cracked whisper. He knows who he is. My stomach turned to stone. The judge slammed her gavel. That's enough, Mr. Combs. But he didn't stop. His voice grew louder, rasping through the courtroom like wind through rusted pipes. They made me do it. I just hosted. They came willingly. You think it ends with me? You think this stops here? He began to laugh, soft, brittle laughter that dissolved into dry coughing. Then he started listing names. One after another. Real names. Famous names. A senator, a studio executive, a billionaire tech founder, a musician beloved across generations, a talk show host. The courtroom erupted. Reporters jumped from their seats. Some scribbled, others froze in horror. The judge banged her gavel over and over, shouting for silence. But Diddy kept going, his voice rising in pitch, filled with panic, with something else, something desperate. He came to the freak off. So did she. They all did. Don't pretend. You don't get success like that without sacrifice. The guards moved to restrain him, but he fought them off with sudden strength, eyes wide, face slick with sweat. He's not gonna like this, he whispered, just before they wrestled him back into his seat. The judge stood, her face pale but her voice steady. Combs, you have been found guilty on all counts. Based on federal sentencing guidelines and the testimony and evidence provided, you are hereby sentenced to 155 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The room inhaled as one. You will be registered as a violent sex offender for the duration of your natural life. All assets under your ownership are to be seized under federal RICO statutes, effective immediately. Diddy's mouth fell open. He didn't speak, not at first. Then his hands started to tremble. And then came the tears. Not normal tears, not grief, not regret. Terror. Pure primal terror. He sobbed, shoulders shaking violently, spit falling from his chin. He clutched at his chest like something inside him was twisting. His mouth moved, but no sound came out for several seconds. Then, at last, he spoke. He's not gonna like this, he whimpered again. He's not gonna like this. I told him I would win. I told him I would walk free. I lied. I lied. Oh God, I lied. The lights exploded. Literally. The bulbs overhead shattered with a crack. Sparks rained down across the courtroom. Someone screamed. Someone else fell trying to duck under a bench. A siren began to howl from somewhere deep in the building, shrill and piercing. The emergency lights flickered red. The judge yelled for the marshals to evacuate the room. One juror collapsed in their seat, eyes rolled back unconscious. The courtroom became a blur of bodies scrambling, shouting, pushing toward the exits. I couldn't move. I looked at Diddy. He wasn't crying anymore. He was looking right at me. His mouth moved silently. A single word. Errant. And then the lights went out. Chapter 7. The jury room packed. The room they put us in after the sentencing wasn't the usual jury room. It wasn't the one with the coffee pot and the fake wood table and the cheap paintings of trees on the wall. This one was different, smaller. No windows, one long metal table with chairs bolted to the floor. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, swaying faintly like it wasn't entirely anchored. It smelled like bleach, but faintly like whatever had been scrubbed away had stained deeper than the chemicals could reach. None of us spoke at first. We just sat, staring at the middle of the table or at the blank stretch of wall ahead of us, as if staring anywhere else might invite something we weren't ready to see. No one had asked us to deliberate again. The sentence had been handed down, the trial over, the cameras silenced. And yet here we were, held back, locked in together like the last survivors of a shipwreck. The guards didn't say why, they just told us to wait. One juror, a man named who worked nights at a pharmaceutical warehouse, ran his hand across the tabletop like he expected it to move. "Feels colder in here than it did in the courtroom," he muttered, mostly to himself. Another woman, who'd barely spoken the entire trial, clutched a cross around her neck so tightly her knuckles went white. I saw her lips move. She was praying, silently, over and over. A few of the others kept their coats on despite the heat from the overhead vents. I hadn't said anything yet, not since the lights exploded and we were herded out like cattle through the back corridors of the courthouse. I hadn't even fully processed that we were still alive, that we'd made it out, that whatever had passed through that courtroom hadn't followed us, or at least not immediately. But then the youngest juror broke the silence. "Does anyone else?" She paused, fidgeting with the sleeve of her jacket, eyes flicking between each of us. "Does anyone else hear the humming?" Everyone looked up. "What humming?" asked. Shrugged, chewing the inside of her cheek. "It's not loud, it's like a vibration, like something deep below your skin. I've heard it every night since the first day of the trial. When the room gets quiet, it comes back, like something trying to tune itself into me." No one laughed, no one dismissed her, because we'd all felt something, maybe not a sound, maybe not exactly the same sensation, but something. Leaned forward and rolled up her left sleeve. Her skin was pale, almost translucent from stress, but on her forearm near the crook of her elbow was a mark, a symbol. It wasn't a bruise, it wasn't ink. It glowed faintly beneath her skin, faint but visible. A glyph, circular, intricate, like a sigil burned into her flesh from the inside out. It pulsed once as she held it up like it was alive. She didn't say anything. She just stared at it, jaw locked tight, tears welling in her eyes but refusing to fall. "What is that?" someone whispered. "I woke up with it," she said flatly, "after the third day. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The way it seemed to shift just slightly depending on how you looked at it, like it wasn't fully part of this world." Another juror stood up and started packing. His name was a retired science teacher with a sharp tongue and a louder voice. But now he looked like a man unraveling. "I knew we weren't just watching a trial," he muttered. "I knew it from the first day, that smell. The way the lights flickered, the way he looked at us. This wasn't about law, this was about..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I looked around at the others. They were all thinking the same thing. It hadn't ended. Not really. Diddy had been sentenced, yes. The judge had read the charges. The gavel had come down. But something was still here, lingering, watching. I stood up. "We need to make a pact," I said, louder than I meant to. My voice echoed faintly against the sterile walls. "Right now, all of us, we don't talk about this, we don't write about it, we don't try to turn it into a book deal or a podcast or a TV show. We forget it, we bury it, and we walk away." A few heads nodded. "Because if we don't," I continued, "whatever that thing was, it'll find its way back, through one of us, through the story, through the curiosity of someone who didn't see what we saw." Nodded slowly, the cross still tight in her grip. Leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "I got a daughter," he said quietly. "She's 5, I haven't held her since this started. If keeping my mouth shut means I get to see her grow up, then I'll take it to my grave." Others murmured their agreement. One by one, people began whispering their own pledges, half prayers, half survival instincts. All except one. She was quiet for a while, hands folded in her lap, staring at the center of the table. Then she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice small but steady. "No," I repeated. "We can't pretend we didn't feed it," she said. "We already did." Her words landed like a cold wind. "What are you talking about?" asked, eyes narrowing. "He said it in the courtroom," replied, looking directly at me now. "He said we were the vessel, and he was right. We didn't just witness what happened. We gave it energy, our fear, our attention, our silence, that thing. It doesn't need sacrifices anymore. It needs stories, and we gave it plenty." No one responded, because we all knew she was right. It wasn't just Diddy's crimes that had created the horror. It was us sitting through them, absorbing them, reacting to them. That courtroom had become something more than just a place of judgment. It had become an altar. The silence stretched long and thin, wrapping around our throats like a noose. Then the door opened. A marshal stepped inside, but not one of the ones we knew. This one was taller, older, face lined with deep creases that didn't look entirely natural. His uniform looked standard but off, like it had been borrowed. His eyes were gray, not the color gray, the feeling gray. He didn't smile. "You can go now," he said, his voice flat. We all looked at him. Then he added, "He's been waiting." No one moved. The air in the room dropped by 10 degrees. Outside the hallway, the emergency light still glowed red. None of us wanted to be the first to stand, because we didn't know who or what was waiting for us beyond that door. Chapter 8, I never left that room. It's been 23 days since I came home, but the walls in my house feel thinner now, like they're not holding anything back. I walk the same floors I used to walk before the trial. I sleep in the same bed beside the same woman I've loved for almost 2 decades, and yet everything feels like it's wearing a mask. The lights hum louder than they used to. The clocks skip seconds when I'm not looking directly at them. Sometimes I'll glance at the digital display on the microwave and it'll flash 3:33, no matter what time of day it is. Just for a blink. Then it corrects itself like nothing happened. Knows something's wrong. She doesn't press me for details, not anymore, but she watches me differently now. Like she's waiting for a part of me to return that never walked through the front door. She says I talk in my sleep. At first, she thought I was just mumbling, old memories, maybe courtroom transcripts playing out in my subconscious. But then one night, I woke up to her standing over me, pale, trembling. She said I'd been whispering names, over and over, names she didn't recognize. Names that didn't sound like names at all. She wrote them down on a notepad and showed it to me the next morning. I couldn't read them. The letters didn't form real words. They curved where they shouldn't. Bent like they were struggling to escape the page. And one of them looked like the mark had on her arm. She doesn't sleep beside me anymore. Not since that night. I tried watching the trial footage. I thought maybe if I confronted it directly, if I sat with it in the safety of my living room, it would lose its power. I found a clip online, courtroom angle, low-res, but clear enough. It was from day 3 when the first anonymous witness spoke behind the screen. I knew the moment well. I remembered where I sat, how my pen shook in my hand, how my throat locked up when she said he doesn't pray to it. He feeds it. But when I watched the footage, my seat was empty. I froze the frame, rewound it, played it again. Everyone else was there, every juror accounted for. But my chair, second from the right front row, was just a void, not empty, just nothing. Like the camera couldn't register me, like I hadn't been there at all. But I felt the weight of that courtroom. I smelled the copper in the air. I saw Diddy's eyes when he said the vessel knows who he is. I was there. So why wasn't I in the frame? The next morning I received a letter. No return address. No stamp. Just placed inside my mailbox like it had always been there. The envelope was dark red, thick parchment paper inside. The handwriting was the same as the note I found in the hotel after the MDC footage, slanted, sharp, like it had been scratched into the page with something sharper than a pen. You were fair, it read. Your offering was accepted. The trial continues. That's all it said. No name, no signature. I burned it, but the smell lingered for hours, sweet and sour, like perfume soaked into rotting wood. Some nights when the house is quiet and has long since locked the bedroom door from the inside, I sit in front of the hallway mirror, not to look at myself, just to watch. Because every now and then when I let my eyes glaze over and the light hits just right, my reflection stops mimicking me. Only for a second, a blink, but it's enough. It happened again last night. I leaned forward, tired, hollow, unshaven. I looked into my own eyes and something blinked back, something deeper, something red. My pupils flickered just for a moment into two slits of pools-ing crimson. I didn't gasp, I didn't scream. I just stood there and watched it disappear, like I'd been expecting it all along. I think I understand now. The trial wasn't about guilt or innocence. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't about putting a man behind bars. It was about selection. We thought we were there to judge him, but we were the ones being judged. We weren't chosen to sit on that jury by chance. We were summoned, each one of us, called like candles to an altar to sit and witness, to feed it, and it fed well. But it's still hungry. There are nights when I hear tapping behind the walls, not like rats or pipes, rhythmic, intentional, like knocking, like someone keeping time on the other side of the drywall. Sometimes the faucet drips in Morse code. I know that sounds crazy, I know how that sounds, but I swear to you I looked it up, and one of the patterns, it spelled out repeat. I think it's coming back. Or maybe I never left. Maybe none of us ever did. Maybe that jury room was never in the courthouse at all. Maybe it was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere outside of time. A waiting room between two realms, one that pretends to be justice and the other that feeds off what justice leaves behind. I don't know how long I have before it comes for me completely. I don't know what happens when the offering is spent, but I can feel it getting closer. Every time I close my eyes, every time I speak without thinking, every time I look into the mirror and see something behind me that isn't there when I turn around. So I'm telling you this now, not to scare you, but to warn you. You think it's over. The real trials are starting now. The courtroom is just the door. And if you get summoned, run.